not shown here, but this is number 3.6, which is multiplying integers, which is 10 times easier than adding and subtracting. Okay. Before we start, I want you to show me 5 examples of integers and 5 counterexamples of integers, or numbers that aren't integers. Okay, so 5 examples could be, any integer, 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up, and then 0, and all of the negative numbers. Okay, so for me, 5 examples would have been 1, 7, -7, 0, and -47. 5 counterexamples could have been any decimal or any fraction. So 1/6, 0.4, 1/8, 4/7, -6/13. Something like that. Okay? So, just as review, we have these numbers, and they all mean the same thing, 2 times 3. Now, this, of course, is the one that we use the most often. The book that we'll use sometimes likes to use this one. They mean the same thing. I hate the x one, though. I do not like that. So let's try to stay away from 2x3, do the 2.3 or parentheses. Okay, and for this, of course, this answer is 6. And what this means is 2 groups of 3. So this is 2 groups of 3. So that's how we get 6 there. Okay, so when we're working with negative numbers, we have 2 times -4, which means 2 groups of -4, which is just -4 plus -4. And if we had something like this, -4 and a +2, well, that's -4 groups of 2. It means the same thing. Okay, so for this, if we're on a number line, we're going to keep looking at the top one here. If we start at 0, and we have one group of -4, that brings us here to -4, and we have a second group of -4, brings us to -8. So our answer here is actually -8. Okay, another way to look at this is if we have 3 times 4 is 12. 2 times 4 is 8. 1 times 4 is 4. And hopefully you see a pattern here. So 0 times 4, well, that's 0. -1 times 4, well, that's -4 if we follow the pattern. And it keeps going. -2 times 4 is -8. So what do we notice here about these 2 problems? Well, I see that if we have a positive number here and a negative number here, that makes our answer negative. And just the opposite of this. So 1 times 4 is 4. -1 times 4 is -4. They look like their answers are just opposites. So we're going to follow that same pattern. If we have, I'm going to move these down so you can see them. If we have a negative times a positive, that means that we're just simply going to take the numbers, multiply them together, and then put a negative answer on it. So 4 times -3 is going to be 4 times 3, which is 12, with a negative on it. So it's -12. -3 times 3 is -9. -3 times 2 is -6. 6 times -8, if the negative's on the right side, it doesn't matter. It's still -48. 8 times -10 is -80. And then the curveball, 4 times 3 is just 12. Doesn't change anything we've already learned. So, if we know that 3 times -2 is -6. 2 times -2 is -4. 1 times -2 is -2. So these are increasing by 2. 0 times anything is 0. So then the question is, what happens when we have a negative times another negative? Well, if we follow our pattern, this becomes a +2, and this becomes a +4. So if we have one negative in the problem, the answer is negative. If we have 2 negatives in the problem, the answer is positive. Okay. So here's our pattern. If we have a positive times a positive or a positive divided by a positive, the answer will be positive. If we have a positive times a negative, or a positive divided by a negative, the answer will be negative. Because if positives and negatives fight, remember that, it's Mr. Evans versus me, the negatives are going to win. Okay, if we have the negatives times, ooh, don't do that. The negative times a positive, negative divided by a positive, the answer will be negative, just like me and Mr. Evans again. And then finally, we have negative times a negative, or a negative divided by a negative. Well, if two negatives fight, they beat each other up so badly that they turn into a positive. Okay? There is no practice here because I feel like you guys have been doing really well and working really hard. But if you bring in this code word into the classroom tomorrow, I owe you a piece of candy.